As we continue from where we left off in Part 1, we'll dive deeper into the horrifying history of slave breeding farms. Revisiting this aspect of slavery is a vital task that requires shedding light on the often overlooked and disturbing facet of history that the perpetrators wish to be long forgotten. These farms, responsible for perpetrating vicious atrocities, have been woefully absent from traditional slavery narratives, rendering the historical account of slavery incomplete. Sadly, these records of these wicked establishments were deliberately destroyed, leaving only a few plantation records, diaries, and memoirs of the victims that have come to light. These surviving accounts have allowed us to comprehend the harrowing experiences of the victims of slavery who bravely lived to share their stories. From the vain objectification of women to the gruesome sex competition among male slaves, we'll be exposing more horrifying facts about slave breeding farms with the hope of preserving this hidden part of history for future generations. When we confront these uncomfortable truths of history, we'll pave the way for a more enlightened society that ensures the mistakes of the past are not repeated. According to historical records, thousands of slaves were tragically subjected to the horrors of breeding farms, where their human rights were violated and unspeakable animalistic atrocities were committed. These disgusting institutions were alarmingly widespread, with as many as 70 such farms operating during that dark period. Behind this cruel enterprise stood wealthy plantation owners who cunningly viewed slave breeding as a profitable business venture. They callously exploited the lives of these enslaved individuals to amass even greater wealth, and use these slaves to avoid the expense of additional labor by producing more enslaved people. To maximize their profits, these heartless plantation owners carefully documented every detail of their slaves' lives, including the birth of children on their farms. This meticulous record-keeping allowed them to effectively monitor their property and extract the maximum financial gain from their suffering. There are also cases where plantation owners would forcefully have sex with young girls on the sex farms they set up, or even force males to have sex with these women solely for breeding purposes. The depths of dehumanization reached in the slave breeding farms are truly disturbing, and one of the most appalling aspects of how enslaved men were manipulated with incentives and rewards to impregnate as many women as possible. Such a practice reduced these men to mere tools for breeding and stripped them down of their dignity and autonomy. Even more horrifying is the fact that some ruthless slave owners organized competitions among enslaved men, turning this heartless act into a sickening game. These so-called sex competitions only fueled a toxic environment, causing enmity and making the enslaved men see each other as rivals, vying to please their selfish owners. The consequence of this barbaric conduct with unimaginable suffering of the enslaved women who were subjected to the non-consensual sexual encounters, causing them immense pain and trauma. The evidence of this inhumanity is recorded in the diary of James Henry Hammond, a Southern slaveholder and a plantation owner. In his diary, he coldly detailed how he forced enslaved men and women into sexual relations for the sole purpose of breeding more slaves. Hammond shamelessly boasted about his illicit affairs with enslaved women, to further emphasize the vile and exploitative nature of the system. In 1839, Hammond acquired two enslaved individuals, an 18-year-old woman named Sally and her 1-year-old daughter Louisa. Tragically, he saw fit to make Sally his mistress, and over the years, he fathered several children with her, all of whom he kept in slavery, believing it to be their supposed happiest earthly condition. 11 years later, he took Louisa as his mistress as well, fathering additional children by her. In addition to his heinous actions with Sally and Louisa, Hammond's cruelty extended to his brother-in-law's 4 young daughters who were between the ages of 13 and 18. He disturbingly described them as lovely and luscious, indicating his predatory and exploitative mentality. Henry Hammond's involvement in slave breeding farms showcases the depths of his sadistic and barbaric mentality. He openly expressed his unwavering support for slavery, even claiming that it was not a sin, but rather commanded by God through Moses and approved by Christ through his apostles. Such deeply entrenched beliefs enabled him and others like him to persist in their vain practices. Even after the abolition of the slave trade, they persisted in their gruesome acts, inflicting immeasurable suffering on countless lives. These historical accounts indicate the level of darkness that can engulf humanity when greed, power, and cruelty overshadow empathy and compassion. Isaac Franklin is another slave breeder who was known for amassing his wealth through the purchase of slaves, and shocking accounts claim that he fathered over 600 children with the female slaves under his ownership. The consequences of these barbaric acts were equally disturbing, as the offspring born from such inhumane practices were cruelly treated as commodities destined to be auctioned off and sold to the highest bidder. These innocent children were born into a world of unimaginable suffering and denied the most basic rights, as they were treated as mere objects to be traded and profited from. Enslaved women on these breeding farms were tragically seen as mere breeding machines, forced to endure violent and non-consensual sexual acts with multiple men, reducing them to objects for the profit and convenience of their ruthless owners. Beyond the appalling sexual exploitation, these women equally faced a multitude of other abuses, such as working under unsanitary and inhumane conditions. Their lives were filled with unimaginable pain, suffering, and dehumanization at the hands of those who viewed them as mere property. Harriet Jacobs' memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, she provides a vivid and heart-wrenching account of her experiences as a slave. She courageously revealed the heartbreaking reality of being forced to have sexual relations with her owner to bear children, who were cruelly destined to endure the same life of bondage as other slaves. Another tragic tale is that of Celia, who suffered repeated rape at the hands of her owner. When she became pregnant, her tormentor callously denied any responsibility for the child, further adding to her anguish. One of the most devastating consequences of these farms was the cruel separation of children from their families after weaning. These innocent young souls were torn away from their parents, siblings, and loved ones, and subjected to the unbearable pain of forced detachment. These separated children were then destined to grow up in a world of slavery, their futures determined not by their dreams or aspirations, but by their owners' desire to profit from their lives. Sadly, many of these children were groomed to become slave breeders themselves, continuing the vicious cycle of the human exploitation. The sale of these slave babies was a heartbreaking scene, where their worth was surprisingly determined by factors like age, health, and gender. This cruel evaluation dictated whether they would be sold at a higher price, which reduced them to nothing more than commodities in the eyes of their owners. Edward E. Baptist's book, The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, powerfully captures the grim reality of slave auctions, where the cries of the enslaved echoed through the air. Families were ripped apart, and the anguish of those being sold was heartbreakingly evident as they desperately reached out to hold onto their loved ones. In the midst of an abhorrent chaos of slave breeding farms, a distressing reality emerges as enslaved women who were deemed good breeders held a twisted form of value to their owners. These unfortunate women received preferential treatment compared to those who were not considered productive breeders. Historians reveal that various factors were used by slave owners to determine a woman's worth as a breeder. These included age, fertility rate, and physical attributes, all of which were coldly scrutinized to maximize their potential for bearing children. In a further display of callousness, plantation owners would hire doctors to oversee the reproductive health of these enslaved women. Medical professionals were tasked with ensuring their good breeders were healthy enough to bear children and were ready to intervene should any complications arise during the breeding process. Shockingly, many of these doctors, like the so-called father of gynecology, Dr. James Marion Sims, denied these enslaved women anesthesia under the false and degrading belief that they did not experience pain like white people. These good breeders were always closely monitored and provided with better living conditions, including clothing and food. They were assigned lesser work and received less severe punishments compared to their counterparts. In fact, newspaper advertisements for slave auctions often indicated the breeding capabilities of female slaves with phrases like good breeders or prolific breeders, boldly written to describe these women. Despite the preferential treatment given to these good breeders, it did not deter slave owners from forcing them into non-consensual sexual encounters. these women continued to be objectified and treated as possessions accessible to the whims of their captors. Regrettably, the appalling condition on the breeding farms had devastating consequences, particularly for the mothers and their newborns. Infant mortality rates surged due to the poor conditions under which many of the female breeders were forced to give birth. The lack of proper medical care and sanitary facilities made childbirth a perilous journey, tragically claiming the lives of many innocent infants. Even for the children who managed to survive, life was far from promising. Malnourishment and neglect were rampant as their well-being was often sacrificed in the pursuit of profit and productivity. These young lives were denied the nurturing care they deserved and were condemned to a life of suffering and hardship from the very moment of their birth. The most sadistic aspect of these breeding farms is the fact that many slave owners like James Henry Hammond shamelessly wrote books and delivered speeches to justify the heinous act of slave breeding. Their attempts to rationalize such cruelty are nothing short of appalling. The various accounts of slave breeding are so horrible and dehumanizing that they are better heard than imagined. That's why we need to keep this crucial part of history alive and continue to remember the immense suffering our great ancestors went through to gain our freedom. Now, tell us, which other horrifying facts do you know about slave breeding farms? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to share this video with your friends so they too can learn about this crucial part of history. Remember, a generation that ignores history has no past and no future. Kindly hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting content on Black history.